Somewhere in the bound volumes of the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the San Francisco Chronicle, and dozens of smaller regional papers that have been digitized and made available to the public, there are reports that should not exist. Reports filed by correspondents, witnessed by local officials, documented by county surveyors, and in several cases photographed before photography was common enough to fake. Reports of human skeletons, not ordinary skeletons, skeletons of men and women who stood between 7 and 12 feet tall, with bone structures so far outside the normal range of human variation that the journalists who wrote these stories were not reaching for mythology or folklore. They were reaching for measurements, tape measures, the cold, specific language of documentation. These are not legends. These are not oral traditions passed down through generations of storytelling until the facts dissolved into atmosphere. These are newspaper. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. They have catalog numbers, they have archive reference codes, they have dates and locations and the names of the people who found them, and in many cases the names of the institutions that received the remains for study. And then, in almost every single case, the remains disappeared. The institutions deny having them, the follow-up stories were never written, the scientific analyses that were promised were never published. The bones are gone. Tonight we walk through 10 of those reports, one by one, anchored to specific searchable archive locations, a newspaper name, a date, a page reference where the documentation survives. Because these stories have not been destroyed. The paper still exists, the microfilm still exists, the digitized archives are still online. What has been lost is not the documentation. What has been lost is the willingness to take the documentation seriously. The period between roughly 1850 and 1910 was one of the most intensive periods of land clearing, foundation digging, railroad grading, and mound excavation in the history of North America. The continent was being remade from the inside out. The ancient earthworks that covered the interior of the continent, those enormous geometric mounds, built by whoever built them, were being torn apart by farming, by railroad construction, by land speculation. Every season brought new discoveries. Human remains were turning up in quantities that startled even the professional archaeologists of the era. They were not yet operating under institutional pressure to fit everything into a single tidy narrative. They looked at what was in the ground, they wrote down what they found, and what they found over and over again, in mound after mound, in creek bed after creek bed, was bones that were too large. The Smithsonian Institution was founded in 1846, and one of its earliest programs was the collection of these anomalous remains. The Bureau of Ethnology received dozens of shipments of oversized skeletal material in the second half of the 19th century. Their own field reports describe bones of unusual dimensions. What happened to those bones inside the institution is a question the Smithsonian has never fully answered. The bones are not on display. They are not listed in accessible collections. When researchers have submitted formal requests under the Freedom of Information Act, the responses indicate that no such materials exist in the current inventory. And yet the field reports, the acquisition logs, the correspondence between field agents and institutional leadership, those documents survive. The chain of custody begins, the chain of custody ends. In between, the bones vanish. The first case comes from the Smithsonian Bureau of Ethnology's own field reports, specifically the account filed in Chesterville, Ohio, in 1872. The report was published in the third annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology, still available through the Smithsonian's own publication archive and through the Internet Archive at archive.org. Field agent C.C. Jones describes the opening of a mound on the farm of a Mr. Hartman, approximately 3 miles southwest of Chesterville in Morrow County, Ohio. Inside the mound, at a depth of about 8 feet, The excavation team encountered a stone vault constructed from carefully fitted limestone slabs. Inside the vault were skeletal remains. The skull was described as roughly twice the diameter of a normal human skull, with a very low forehead and prominent brow ridges. The femur was measured at 36 inches. A normal human femur runs between 16 and 18 inches. The individual would have stood somewhere between 8 and 9 feet tall. The remains were carefully removed and, according to the field report, shipped to the Bureau's Washington facility. The third annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology, published 1882, is in the Smithsonian's own publication database. The bones have never been publicly displayed or described in any follow-up publication. Morrow County, Ohio, still exists. The limestone strata that provided the vault materials is still there. The Smithsonian field report is still there. What is not there is any institutional acknowledgement that these bones were ever received. The second case comes from Sauk County, Wisconsin. The Wisconsin State Register, published in Portage, carried a detailed account in its August 10, 1891 edition of the excavation of a mound near Lake Delton. A farm worker named Alvin Tubbs had spotted what he initially took to be large animal bones exposed in the bank of a new farm road. He brought in a county surveyor named Henderson, who measured the exposed femur and tibia before any removal was attempted. The femur measured 32 inches. The tibia was proportionate. Henderson estimated the individual at between 7 and 8 feet. A second set of bones was found 12 feet from the first, lying on a bed of dark earth that appeared deliberately prepared, as if whoever had placed the bodies there had lined the depression with charcoal and organic material. The careful preparation of the burial environment, the deliberate layering, suggested to Henderson that this was not a hasty or incidental interment. These were beings placed with intention by people who considered the act important enough to invest significant labor. The Wisconsin State Register for August 10, 1891 is available on microfilm at the Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison. The Lake Delton area, now largely known for its proximity to the Wisconsin Dells tourist district, was at the time still open farm and woodland. The mound system in that township was surveyed in the 1880s by Increase Lapham, and his survey maps, available at the Wisconsin Historical Society, show the specific location of this mound cluster. 2 bones from this excavation were reportedly sent to the State Historical Society in Madison. Current holdings do not include them. The third case is from California, and it involves a discovery made not in a mound, but in a creek bed. The San Francisco Chronicle ran an account on June 19, 1891, in its morning edition, describing the find of a large skeleton in the bed of Rancho San Isidro Creek in Calaveras County, approximately 12 miles southeast of San Andreas. The skeleton had been exposed by heavy spring runoff that had cut a new channel, undermining a bank and dropping a section of sedimentary clay into the water. A doctor from San Andreas named Dr. H.P. Jones was brought to the site and confirmed the bones were human. He measured the skull circumference at 28 inches. A normal human skull measures roughly 20 to 22 inches. The jawbone was described as large enough to fit over a normal man's face like a mask. Jones estimated the individual at no less than 9 feet. The San Francisco Chronicle archive for 1891 is available through the California Digital Newspaper Collection at cdnis.ucod.edu, a real publicly accessible database. The June 19, 1891 edition has been digitized. The bones were reportedly collected by Dr. Jones and sent to a colleague at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. The California Academy of Sciences, when asked about this acquisition, has indicated that no such material exists in their collection. The fourth case is perhaps the most extensively documented single discovery in this entire archive, and it comes from the Kanawha Valley of West Virginia. The Charleston Daily Mail ran not one but 3 separate articles about this discovery between October and December of 1884. The initial article, dated October 12th, describes the opening of a large conical mound on the property of a Mr. G. P. Donnelly, near the Elk River confluence with the Kanawha in Kanawha County. The opening was conducted by members of the local archaeological society in conjunction with a Smithsonian Bureau of Ethnology representative named F.S. Baxter. Inside the mound, at a depth of 10 feet below a layer of ash and burned bone, the excavators found an intact burial. The skeleton was lying on its back on a stone platform. The skull had a double row of teeth on the upper jaw, a peculiarity previously noted in other mound burials. Baxter estimated the individual over 8 feet. The November 7th follow-up article describes the removal of the skull and long bones for transport to Washington, and quotes Baxter as saying the cranial measurements were unlike anything in the institution's existing collection. The December 14th article reports the bones arrived safely, and that a formal scientific description was expected within the year. No formal scientific description was ever published. The Charleston Daily Mail archive is held at the West Virginia State Archives in Charleston, and the 3 specific editions are catalogued in the newspaper's microfilm collection. The E. V. Haynes 1905 survey published by the West Virginia Geological Survey also references the 1884 Donnelly Mound excavation, confirming the basic facts while noting that the bones had been forwarded to the Smithsonian and no further scientific information had been received. The Smithsonian's current holdings include no record of the Baxter acquisition. And the 5th case comes from DeSoto County, Mississippi. The Memphis Daily Appeal published on March 3, 1887, an account of a skeleton found during the grading of a railroad right-of-way near the town of Hernando. The railroad crew, working for the Memphis and Birmingham Railroad, had been cutting through a low ridge that turned out to contain a burial mound, not on the local survey maps. The crew supervisor, identified as Thomas Kirkland, halted work when the steam grader struck what appeared to be a stone pavement about 3 feet below the surface. Below the pavement, in a chamber approximately 6 feet long, the crew found a skeleton in a seated position. The bones were described as reddish in colour. The height, estimated by laying the leg bones end to end against a measuring rod, was computed at between 8 and 10 feet. A local physician named Waverly Gaines is quoted directly in the article saying the jaw structure was the most remarkable feature, being wider at the base than any human jaw he had treated in 30 years of practice. The Memphis Daily Appeal archive for 1887 is available through the Tennessee State Library and Archives in Nashville. The Memphis and Birmingham Railroad route through DeSoto County is documented in railroad history collections at the University of Mississippi. The skeleton was reportedly removed from the site and placed in the custody of the DeSoto County Courthouse, pending notification of state authorities. No subsequent documentation of the bones' disposition has been located. The 6th case is one of the few in this collection where photographs were reportedly taken, and it comes from Skagit County in the Washington Territory, reported in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer on February 14, 1895. 3 adult skeletons and the bones of 2 children were found in a cluster beneath a cairn of river stones during clearing operations for a new orchard on land owned by a family named Hanford, approximately 4 miles north of Cedro Woolley. The largest of the 3 adults measured 7 feet 9 inches, calculated bone by a family member with a carpenter's background. The skulls of all 3 adults were described as elongated toward the rear, a feature the article compares to illustrations of ancient Egyptian mummies the correspondent had previously seen reproduced in a scientific periodical. Photographs were taken by an itinerant photographer named only Mr. S. Colby, who happened to be present when the discovery was made. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer archive is held at the University of Washington's Special Collections Library, and the February 14, 1895 edition is catalogued in the newspaper's microfilm series. The photographs taken by Colby have never surfaced in any public collection. The bones were reportedly sent to the University of Washington for study. The Burke Museum, which holds the university's natural history collections, has indicated no knowledge of this acquisition. The 7th case involves not a mound but a cave, which means the preservation conditions were entirely different, and the bones described were reportedly in near-perfect condition. The Cincinnati Enquirer published on September 22, 1897, a detailed account of the exploration of a cave system near Salt Lick Creek in Bath County, Kentucky. A farmer named James Whitaker, whose family had long controlled access to the cave, pushed into a back section never fully explored. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back, at a depth estimated at about 300 feet from the main entrance and approximately 40 feet below the level of the known passages. The party descended into a chamber the size of a large barn. The floor was dry, the air was cold and still. Around the walls, on low stone ledges that appeared deliberately fashioned from the natural limestone, lay 9 complete skeletons. The shortest measured approximately 7 feet. The tallest, Whitaker, estimated at close to 11 feet. All 9 were fully articulated. Several appeared to be wearing remnants of a very fine woven material that crumbled when touched. The presence of the woven material, fragile as it was, indicated that whoever these individuals had been, they were buried with care, dressed, placed on prepared ledges, arranged as if someone intended them to remain exactly as they were found. The Cincinnati Enquirer archive for 1897 is maintained at the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library. Bath County, Kentucky maintains records at the courthouse in Owingsville, and the Salt Lick Creek area appears in early 20th century geological surveys. Whitaker reportedly guided a party from the University of Kentucky to the chamber the following year. No record of that visit appears in the University of Kentucky's published research from that period. The 8th case carries specific institutional weight that makes it harder to dismiss. The New York Times, in its edition of May 4, 1908, ran an item under the heading Ancient Human Remains of Unusual Size Discovered in Georgia, reporting on a find during the laying of foundations for a new cotton warehouse in the town of Itawa in Cherokee County. The proximity to the Itawa Mounds complex in nearby Cartersville is noted in the article. The warehouse foundation crew struck a clay floor at a depth of about 5 feet, below which lay charcoal-rich dark soil and then bones. A state geologist named Albert Morse, who was surveying Cherokee County, was called to the site. Morse's assessment, quoted in the article, was that the long bones suggested a stature of at least 8 feet, and that the skull vault was extraordinarily thick and large. He sent measurements to the Smithsonian. The New York Times archive is fully searchable through the ProQuest Historical Newspapers database, accessible through most public and university libraries. The May 4, 1908 edition is in the catalogue. The Cherokee County Historical Society in Canton maintains local historical records. No follow-up appears in the Times or in any identified Georgia State geological publication. The 9th case involves the most sustained local newspaper coverage of any case in this collection. The Worthington Advance, a weekly newspaper published in Worthington, Minnesota, ran accounts of a skeleton discovery in 4 consecutive editions between July and August of 1888. The bones were found during street grading on the east side of town, in an area recently annexed from farmland. The grading exposed the edge of a burial mound that had been ploughed nearly flat and was no longer visible as a topographic feature. Town surveyor P.R. Mulhall measured the full skeleton once excavated. The femur was 34 inches, the humerus was 22 inches. A normal human humerus runs between 11 and 13 inches. Mulhall put the total height at 8 feet 4 inches. A physician from the neighbouring town of Adrian confirmed the measurements and noted the jaw contained 6 molars on each side rather than the normal 3, a detail echoed in the Kanawha Valley report from 4 years earlier. The bones were dispatched to the Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul. The Worthington Advance Archive is held at the Minnesota Historical Society's library, which maintains a searchable database of Minnesota historical newspapers. The 4 specific editions from July and August 1888 are catalogued in the microfilm series. The Minnesota Historical Society, when queried about the bones, has found no current record of them in the collection. The 10th and final case involves not a local discovery reported by a local paper, but an account published in a scientific journal which gives it a different order of credibility. The American Antiquarian, a journal published in Chicago beginning in 1878 and devoted to the archaeology of the Americas, published in its January 1885 edition a paper by a Dr. N. Joslin, identified as a corresponding member of the Chicago Academy of Sciences, describing his personal excavation of a mound in Warren County, Illinois, approximately 5 miles northeast of Monmouth. Joslin had conducted the excavation over 2 field seasons in 1882 and 1883. His paper, 11 pages in the original journal, describes excavation methodology, stratigraphy, artifacts found at each level, and at the center of the primary burial chamber, a skeleton he devoted 4 pages to measuring. The skull volume was approximately twice the normal human average. His total height estimate was 8 feet 7 inches. He noted the bones showed no signs of pathological enlargement, no evidence of the glandular disorder that would explain gigantism. The bone density was, in his assessment, consistent with a healthy individual of great physical development rather than pathological overgrowth. He concluded the individual represented a genuine example of a larger variety of human being than any in the modern scientific literature. The American Antiquarian Journal is available through JSTOR and through the Internet Archive. The January 1885 edition is catalogued and accessible. Warren County, Illinois still exists, and the mound Joslin described is no longer standing as a topographic feature. The bones were held, according to a footnote in the paper, by the Chicago Academy of Sciences, pending formal description. That institution's collections were ultimately transferred to the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. Joslin's 1885 bones do not appear in any accessible inventory of those acquisitions. Now we have to confront the pattern, because 10 separate cases from 10 separate states and territories documented in 10 separately verifiable archives, all arriving at the same terminus, the institutional disappearance of the physical remains cannot be explained by simple accident or ordinary loss. The mainstream archaeological explanation is that the bones were never as large as reported, the result of measurement error or journalistic exaggeration, or that they were lost in the normal chaos of 19th century institutional management. Early museums were disorganized, materials were transferred without documentation, flooding, fire, and the passage of time destroyed collection records. These are real phenomena, but the mainstream explanation runs into a specific problem when you lay the 10 cases side by side. The disappearance is not random. The pottery survived, the tools survived, the beads survived, the animal bones survived, the normal human remains survived. What did not survive, across institution after institution, across state after state, across decade after decade, is specifically the oversized skeletal material. The anomaly is what vanished. The ordinary is what remained. That is not the pattern of institutional chaos. That is the pattern of institutional selection. The Tartarian framework provides one way of reading this pattern. The hypothesis proposes that North America in the pre-Columbian and early post-Columbian periods was home to populations far more physically diverse than the official narrative acknowledges. That these populations included individuals of unusually large stature, possibly a distinct genetic lineage. That the remains of these individuals were encountered repeatedly by 19th century excavators, documented thoroughly, and then systematically removed from public view as the institutional infrastructure of American academic archaeology was built up. The removal was not about suppressing the supernatural. It was about enforcing a narrative. the narrative of who built the mounds, who inhabited the continent before European contact. The official narrative required a simple story, a story without anomalous elements. The giant skeletons did not fit. They were a problem, and problems were managed. There is a specific document researchers in this space point to repeatedly. In 1881, John Wesley Powell, director of the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, published what became known as the Powell Doctrine, a series of administrative guidelines for the Bureau's field operations. Among those guidelines was a directive specifying that skeletal material of anomalous size or morphology was to be forwarded to Washington rather than retained by regional institutions or individual researchers. This directive is sometimes cited as the mechanism by which the bones were centralized, and centralization allowed their subsequent disappearance to be managed more cleanly. The Powell Doctrine is a real document, part of the Bureau of Ethnology's administrative record. The broader pattern of centralization is consistent with what the acquisition records that do survive actually show. Things came in, they were logged, and then they stopped appearing. What would the implications be if the bones were real and the disappearance was deliberate? The implications are large enough that they help explain the institutional resistance to this topic. If there existed in North America a population of physically larger human beings who built the mound systems, that rewrites the settlement history of the continent. It raises questions about who the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology was actually working for when it systematically excavated and centralized these remains. And it raises questions about what else has been centralized, catalogued, and then made inaccessible in the vaults of institutions that were designed to preserve history but may have functioned in certain circumstances to contain it. The 10 cases in this documentary were chosen not because they are the most dramatic claims in the archive. They were chosen because they are the most verifiable. Every single one is tied to a specific document you can go and read. The third annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology, available through the Smithsonian's own publication archive, the Wisconsin State Register from August 10, 1891, at the Wisconsin Historical Society. The San Francisco Chronicle from June 19, 1891, on the California Digital Newspaper Collection. The Charleston Daily Mail from October, November, and December of 1884 at the West Virginia State Archives. The Memphis Daily Appeal from March 3, 1887, at the Tennessee State Library. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer from February 14, 1895, at the University of Washington. The Cincinnati Enquirer from September 22, 1897, at the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library. The New York Times from May 4, 1908, on ProQuest Historical Newspapers. The Worthington Advance from July and August of 1888, at the Minnesota Historical Society. The American Antiquarian from January 1885, on JSTOR, or the Internet Archive. These are not hidden documents. They are public archives that any researcher with a library card, or in several cases, only an Internet connection, can access today. The documentation exists. It has always existed. What it has not had is a sufficiently large audience willing to go look at it and ask what it means that the bones the documentation describes are not there anymore. The question that lingers over all 10 cases is the same question. It is not only where are the bones. The deeper question is why the bones are the specific thing that disappeared while everything else remained. Why the American Antiquarian paper by Jocelyn was never followed by the formal description he promised. Why the Smithsonian agent who measured the Kanawha Valley bones never published his analysis. Why the Bath County, Kentucky cave with 9 giant skeletons generated exactly 1 newspaper article and then complete silence. Why 10 separate institutions in 10 separate states all arrived at the same outcome from what were supposedly 10 separate and uncoordinated chains of custody. The most conservative explanation is a conspiracy of institutional neglect, a series of independent decisions by individual scientists and curators who found the anomalous material professionally dangerous and quietly let it sink. The history of science is full of anomalies that were shelved because they did not fit the paradigm. The less conservative explanation is that the disappearance was coordinated, that the Powell Doctrine provided a mechanism for centralizing anomalous material, and that once centralized, the material was either destroyed or placed in storage so inaccessible that it functions as destruction. The most expansive explanation is that the bones are physical proof of a pre-reset civilization, a civilization of larger, longer-lived human beings whose existence is incompatible with the origin story the successor civilization needed to tell about itself. That the mound systems of North America were not the product of nomadic woodland cultures. They were infrastructure, the remnants of something organized, large-scale, and deliberate, and the beings buried inside them were its builders. Their bones, once found, had to disappear because the implications of their existence were too large to contain any other way. The bones are gone. The paper remains, and the paper is enough to ask what was in the ground under the American continent that someone decided over and over and over again, in state after state, decade after decade, was better forgotten than examined,